What does Amarone mean? In this video, I'm going to share the story of Amarone like it's never been told before. I'm Tony Margiotta, author of Hidden Gems of Italy, and make sure you subscribe to Gladiator Wine TV so you don't miss out on the inside scoop on all things dealing with Italian wine. So like Brunello di Montalcino, Barolo, and Barbaresco, Amarone is considered not just one of Italy's best Italian red wines, but also one of the world's greatest wines. What's interesting is that Amarone really became a highly acclaimed wine throughout the world around 2010, not that long ago, while the other wines I just mentioned had been worshipped for decades and decades before that time. So you could say Amarone is the youngest of the world-acclaimed Italian wines. But what I'm about to share with you might conflict with what you've heard or read in the past. Amarone is not a new wine. It's not even close to being a new wine. The story of Amarone's origins can be actually traced back for millennia. More on that in a minute. Not only is the history of Amarone controversial, but so is its name. So let's begin with that. What does Amarone really mean? If you listen to the experts, they'll tell you the name means the big bitter. I'm here to tell you that that is misinformation. First, let's go along with the literal translation for a second. In Italian, the word for bitter is amaro. Anytime you add the ending letters O-N-E to a word in Italian, it makes that word bigger or better. For example, libro means book in Italian. Librone means big book. Or porta, which means door, and portone means big door. So naturally, you think that adding O-N-E to amaro would mean big bitter, amarone. The problem is that if you've ever tasted an Amarone, the last word you'd ever use to describe it would be bitter, let alone big bitter. So the first time the term Amarone was coined was in 1936 by a wine cellar manager at Villa Novare, which is now Villa Mosconi Bertani, by the name of Adelino Lucchese. In the cellar, they were aging 𝐻𝐸𝐻, which is an ancient sweet red wine made in the Valpolicella area of Veneto for thousands of years. 𝐻𝐸𝐻 was the best wine coming out of the Valpolicella in the 1930s. And apparently, one of the barrels containing 𝐻𝐸𝐻 had been forgotten in the wine cellar. And the wine inside that barrel continued to ferment for a very long time. Most, if not all, the sugar had been converted to alcohol by the time Mr. Lucchese found it. Since it was no longer a sweet red wine and turned into a dry wine, Mr. Lucchese apparently said, "Questo non è un amaro, ma amarone," which means in Italian, this isn't a bitter wine, it's a big bitter. And from that point on, the first bottles with the word Amarone began to appear on the labels of wine bottles just a few years later. My question is, do you really think 1936 was the first time they left 𝐻𝐸𝐻 wine in a barrel to age too long? Naturally sweet red wines, like 𝐻𝐸𝐻, were made by stopping the yeasts during fermentation to prevent them from eating up all the sugars. This kept the wine sweet, but it also contained alcohol. But in the old days, it would have been easy to overlook a barrel that perhaps wasn't fully sealed properly, and the wine continued to ferment slowly, eating up all the sugars from the grape juice. It's a nice story to say that Amarone was discovered by accident in 1936, but I personally don't buy it. I prefer looking at this period as the Amarone awakening. In ancient Roman times, sweet wines were considered higher quality and more desirable. When the wines were bitter, they would add water or honey to make them more palatable. In those times, a wine was either sweet or bitter. Dry wines, on the other hand, are a relatively newer and more desirable style of wine to our palates today. If you look at ancient Roman literature, you don't see too much talk about dry wines. You read about either bitter or sweet wines. For example, the Roman poet Catullus, who lived between 84 and 54 BC, wrote about a cálices amariores, which in Latin meant bitter wine glasses, referring to wines in the Valpolicella area. Very interesting. There was also an Italian writer named Francesco Scipione Maffei, who in the early 1700s wrote about a bitter wine of a particular grace in Valpolicella. Also very interesting. Clearly still using ancient Roman descriptions of wine as being either amaro for bitter or dolce for sweet. And so Mr. Lucchese in 1936 was likely continuing that tradition of describing wines that were not sweet but instead bitter. But they could very well have been what we'd call dry today. For us today, there's a difference in taste between bitter and dry. But in 1936, dry wines had not had their awakening to the wine drinking public just yet. So the literal translation is big bitter, but what he really meant was a big dry wine. Today, a classic Amarone will be a big, full-bodied wine, fruit forward, but with a long, dry finish. And in fact, a bitter Amarone today would be considered to be of poor quality. So if you want to learn more about Amarone, I have an entire series of videos about Amarone here on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe to Gladiator Wine TV by clicking the subscribe button below. And if you're looking for a fun activity, we can take a deeper dive in the world of Amarone together, because I host a virtual Italian wine class for your group of friends, families, colleagues, or clients. My email address is found in the description below. Reach out to me, and remember that great wines are not made in great numbers. And I'll see you in the next video.